Hi there. So it's Tuesday morning. I'm very busy today, but I've just come back yesterday from an end gendered violence or end gender violence forum, and it gave me a lot of food for thought. And to be sure, these are issues that I think about a lot, not just in a theoretical way, but also on the basis of my own life experiences. On the one hand, growing up in a context of family violence, but also being exposed to CSA. It's much more complex for people who are LGBT. Our voices are not necessarily prominent in public discourse and in institutional support and policy making. So I just want to give you a heads up about why that's important. Rates of CSA, and again, if you don't know the acronym, please do look it up, were 1.8% for heterosexual men, according to one study, and I'll tell you which study that is shortly. 25.0% for bisexual men, and 27.3% for gay men, which of course is a highly significant difference. When we talk about 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 young male children, that can be lost from the picture. So that particular study is childhood sexual abuse experienced by gay and bisexual men, understanding the disparities and interventions to help eliminate them, from a book called Unequal Opportunity: Health Disparities Affecting Gay and Bisexual Men in the United States. So the authors of the chapter are David Purcell, Jocelyn D. Patterson, and Pilgrim S. Spikes Jr. Then listen to this particular report's statistic. Transgender women, in particular, report the highest rates of CSA, with prevalence rates as high as 58.2%. That is, of transgender women reporting childhood sexual abuse. And that study is from Attachment Buffers Against the Association Between Childhood Sexual Abuse, Depression, and Substance Use Problems Among Transgender Women, a moderated mediation model from Psychological Sex. The co-authors are K.M. Sizemore, A. Talon, N. Forbes, S. Gray, H. Park, and H.J. Rendina. So to be sure, they were done in the United States, and there's not a whole lot of research that is Australian-based. But I think that we can assume that there are some similarities. So we need to be able to understand our lives and experiences, theorize from them, lift up the voices of victim survivors, to tell not only their stories, but theorize from them, to insert themselves into public discourse and policy responses. Now, it's important because these voices are so often overlooked in all sorts of anti-violence work. And to give you an idea, I suppose, of how that is so, I would like to show you something, which if I can find it in the share function. Okay, I'm going back to Safari. This is what I saw put up as a projection in yesterday's End Violence Against Women workshop. I'm getting there. There's just a hell of a lot of things that are currently open. Okay. So here we have a gender-based violence tree. And it was designed by women and girls Center to End Violence Against Women. And you can see here, depicted in the tree, root causes of violence. You can see within the tree's branches, context of the violence, and then in what is the growth out from there, different types of violence. Now, I won't go into every detail here, but suffice to say that factors such as transphobia and cisnormativity, bundled together with ableism, class discrimination, obviously patriarchy, but also racism and colonialism, ageism, for example, with elder abuse, but also homophobia, biphobia, and heteronormativity go in to inform the causes of this violence. I'll talk to how that's so, but you can see how those root causes feed into domestic and family violence, structural violence, sexual harassment, lateral violence, including within communities and within, for example, same-sex relationships, and intimate partner violence. It can have those different expressions. However, these gendered drivers of violence or root causes, which I referred to, are harder for people to see. And part of the problem is that we don't speak from our lives, from our experiences, and we don't get centered in these sorts of discussions, which tend to a binary kind of view of gender, sex-gender relations, which obviously is kind of encompassed in that term cisnormativity, but you can see there how these elements are less visible to people, and yet it's urgent for us to understand them. So I'm going to use an example from, I guess, my own experiences. I'll stop sharing right now. Oh, hang on. I can go to the next. Okay. So fundamentally, in the process of recovery from PTSD or complex PTSD, one does a lot of body work, whether it be yoga, Pilates, other practices that help to connect mind and body to release certain kinds of trapped emotions and patterns. But within EMDR in particular, which is eye movement, desensitization and reprocessing therapy, we commonly refer to the body and go back to the body. So I put in this little diagram, self and body, as being the starting point of my experiences in the world, including of, in this case, obviously, domestic violence that I experienced growing up. It can also be understood as family violence because there's more than one person committing that violence. And also CSA. These have formed my experiences of oppression and subjection, but also have been the grounds for adaptations in the face of this violence. Now, on the side of CSA, we have a couple of terms which were concepts attributed to me in relation to my body in the context of this domestic violence and CSA by the parent perpetrator and the parent who was also a victim, that is of DV. Effeminacy being called effeminate, being perceived as effeminate, being singled out as a problem, as abnormal, as an exception, as errant, as wrong. Yeah. The parent who was also victimized struggled with my own expression from the body, and as I grew up, and when I attempted to come out or relate to them, my own particular kinds of senses of self but also my experiences of abuse, that is, disclosing for the first time. I was positioned as someone possessive of an asexuality, that is, not being sexual, not having my own sexual self or agency, but instead from the parental discourse, which to be sure is infused with phobia around gender variance, as well as layers of homophobia, heteronormativity, those root causes that we saw before, cisnormativity and transphobia, which really pressed down on the possibilities of resisting and reinforced, in a sense, the conditions of possibility for continued abuse, continued violences on myself and body. So, given that these are less visible, but we must theorize from our lives, we need to bring in these elements into our discussions. And I wrote to one of my sisters the other day, I feel that homo and transphobia are ways in which, for example, perpetrators procure victims and maintain through a grooming process forms of shaming. They're undergirded by those phobias, those discourses of otherness and abnormality, singling out, that exist within the culture, but also play out within the gender relations of the home. Curiously, as we saw from those stats earlier, it's mainly gender variant children who are targeted because these children, we've been brought into this kind of grooming relationship, but made to feel that they're at fault. So being singled out already for their gender variance, but also being targeted through grooming into strategies of obviously possession and sexual abuse, but whereby the sort of construct of victim blaming and shaming through discourses that relate to homophobia and transphobia really compound and close or foreclose the possibility of being able to resist CSA and disclose and get support. So they are of a piece. The social forces that are termed homophobia, that are termed transphobia, that operate in the culture more widely, but also within the family, militate against being able to disclose, being able to seek support, being recognized, and instead, in this case, a young child such as myself is singled out as the problem, as being the source of the ill, so to speak. And also the kind of accentuated expressions of homophobia, which are forms of punishment, become a cover as well to situate the abuser as being outside of those so-called social ills, being an upstanding heterosexual family man, and basically using these as kinds of weapons to abuse. So these are painful experiences to return to and to talk to, but it is really valid for us to excavate them in the way in which we theorize from our worlds, from our body, from ourselves, in order to get redress. So for myself as a child, I was kind of trapped in these representations of myself, as well as physically trapped within relations of violence. In the outside world as well, that is outside of the family, it was well nigh impossible to get any breathing space. So between being positioned as effeminate or someone without a sexuality, my sense of embodied self and my gender identity could not be given any kind of recourse to liberation and recognition. So we can see how the different forces of oppression, if you understand them intersectionally, do play out in the most intimate ways and through these forms of violence. I would also recognize that the gender drivers of violence that I've been speaking to, which are harder for people to see, mutually reinforce each other. So, for example, the context of ongoing colonialism, the logics of colonialism, as they interlock with patriarchy, the idea of binary gender, yeah, and also the other techniques of exclusion and othering that are achieved through racism, sexism. All of these things interlock, and we must be able to theorize from our particular experiences that as victim survivors, we have a voice, we have an analysis. We're not just here to be theorized about. These can create tools for us to intervene, to cut through the discourses, including as they continue to be weaponized socially and culturally against us. Because that is the difficulty, the major challenge for people such as myself, who come from LGBTQ experience and who also have been exposed to reiterative forms of violence over their life. The possibility of being completely disempowered and to merely become a statistic, whether through the ravages of drug and alcohol use, having to contend with the justice system, our experiences of homelessness as well, once we're ejected from the family environment, the material breaches that we live through. Now, I came from a class background that was working class, and there was never any space for someone who was gay or trans in the 1980s, not even in the wider culture. So you can see how these different forces mutually inform one another and reproduce horizons of violence and make it hard for us to cut through. For me, questions of trans liberation are intimately connected to resisting gender-based violence, but we need to be able to understand these contexts and root causes. We can, from our own lives, speak to them and generate tools to intervene and transform not only our lives, but the lives of many others who have had to face these same relations of violence in their different faces.